Okay, hello there, everyone. Good morning. How you guys doing? You guys can all hear me okay? All righty. Cool, we'll get started in just a minute here. So yeah, today we'll have a lecture on abstract versus representational art, and also how to use shapes in your artwork. So yeah, these first few weeks or whatever, I'm going to kind of be throwing like a lot of concepts at you guys, but just know everything in these lectures, the whole class kind of builds on itself. So even stuff I went over last class, stuff I'm going over today, these are things I expect you guys to use on all of the future projects, and I want to see in your work. So just make sure you're taking good notes as we're working through today. Make sure you're asking me questions if anything's confusing. And then make sure you guys are like rewatching the lectures or anything if you just need it repeated or you missed part of it or whatever as we go through the quarter. So yeah, just note. So we got our project 01 due on Monday, right? Next week. How are you guys feeling about that first project? Are you guys confident, nervous, thumbs up, thumbs down? Feeling good? Some people started it, hopefully. In the middle, good. All right. So hopefully, yeah, the videos on YouTube, give you guys enough information to kind of walk you through the project. I had a student come to lab hours yesterday, so just remember those lab hours are open for you guys to pop in anytime. I can look at your projects, I can give you suggestions on how to improve it, so please pop over there, pop into lab hours if you ever have any questions. You can also just email me your project before the due date, and I can say, this all looks good, but maybe move around one or two things to increase your score as well. So yeah, so this first project, again, as I mentioned, it's not really creative, but I just need to like kind of force you guys to get this basic down, the basics of Illustrator down before we get on to more complicated projects. And yes, Ryan, good question. So this first project is all in Illustrator. All of the first project is done in Illustrator. So this is different than future projects, because the future projects will start as a sketch and you'll do some sketching and then translate it into Illustrator. But yeah, this first project, just all in Illustrator, no drawings in your sketchbook or anything like that. Any other questions in general on project 01? Okay, Regan, just keep me posted on making sure you're able to get a computer as we get closer to the due date for the project and stuff. Any other questions on that? Just one thing I want to make sure you guys do on that. So here's Illustrator. So as you go through your boxes, and like in each box, I want to see that variety of lines for box 1, variety of rectangles for box 2. So you see how this one here has that pattern fill on it. I do want to see that in some of your shapes. So here's a shape I drew with the pen tool. So to add a pattern fill to it, there's a couple different ways here. You can find this little box here that is for your fill. And then the little library down here. I show this in the videos, but I just want to make sure you guys have a few of those shapes with patterns in it. Patterns, basic graphics. And these ones are kind of the best ones. because they're just simple black and white patterns. And these can be fun to use. So I just want to make sure you guys know where these are and can put these as fills for some of your shapes in the first project. Because then when we work on different projects later on, then you can go back and use some of these patterns for the artwork you're making. You can use that for textures and things like that, but you got to know where all of this stuff is first before you go and start to create a piece of artwork for it. So make sure on your shapes, whether it be your rectangle or the shape you draw with the pen tool or your ovals, that you have some of them with these texture lines on there that I can see, and also do some that even without the texture line, but use these thick to thin settings as well, because this is a really nice way to get that variety of line weight, so that we just talked about for the last class. So having texture lines around your shapes, having thick to thin lines, and then also make sure you can change the value of it. So remember, no color in this project. I don't want to see any like bright red strokes or nothing like that on the first project or on any project really. So just shades of gray for that. So all that stuff is in the videos, but I just want to make sure I see those texture lines around your shapes and some pattern fills for some of those as well. All right, any other questions on project one before we move on? All right. So what do you guys think of the drawing challenge, the line weight drawing with the house and the grass and the water in the distance? You guys enjoy that? How about people that hadn't drawn much? Was that an okay?
It was cool. It was cool.
First step for your drawing?
Yeah.
Good. Yeah, Cameron said it took a while because they're slow. That's okay. You know, being slow with your drawing is fine. But like, so those are kind of exercises where if we were in an in-person class, I would have us all, you know, draw together in our sketchbooks for the, you know, 15, 20 minutes or whatever. So really the best way to get you guys more comfortable with that drawing is just to kind of have you guys be forced to do that every week. And then when we start doing thumbnails and coming up with ideas for your projects, you'll kind of have some of these tools already. It's like, oh, for one of my projects, I could draw a house on a hill. And how many different ways can I draw this? I've already drawn it one way from a drawing challenge, and I could do, you know, different things with it. I also really enjoyed seeing it when people added different stuff to the drawing. So some people added some you know, boats in there or different things on the path, or changed the shape of the house or added stuff to the house. So most of the drawing challenge, I definitely am happy to have you guys add and make it your own drawing rather than just copying that picture exactly. And definitely look at each other's drawings too. So again, if we were in the classroom, what I do after, you know, we do some drawings, I have everyone put their drawings out and kind of just walk around and look at each other's drawings, or meet in small groups and look at each other's drawings. But that's a really good way to get inspiration and ideas is from each other. And you can borrow ideas from people. So you're not going to copy anyone's artwork or ideas exactly, but you're like, oh, I really liked, maybe it just might be a certain tool they were drawing with, or it might be a certain way they did some line work. And you can borrow little ideas like that from each other and then apply that to your own work. So take the time after you submit your drawing or towards the end of the time that the discussion's up, to look at each other's work too. And definitely you can offer add comments, as I saw some of you guys did on that work. All right, so for today, we got a couple different things we will talk about. Okay. Okay, why don't you guys write these words down? These are kind of some vocabulary we will be using today. Oh, Ryan, that's a good question. Are you talking about for using it with Illustrator? For getting a Wacom tablet? I do not use my tablet for Illustrator. So I have a Wacom tablet right here. So I'll be drawing on Photoshop. I use this for drawing on Photoshop, not for drawing on Illustrator. I find it easier just to use a regular mouse when working in Illustrator. I find it's a little more precise to just use the clicking rather than trying to tap and drag with the pen. So I don't think it's necessarily necessary for that, but some people have used it, the tablets before. So if you want to get one and try it, you can definitely do that, but it's definitely not necessary to use. All right, so here's some basic vocabulary. So we went over line last class, so all different types of lines. I really like seeing the different lines you guys came up with. On the drawing challenge, it was cool to see, especially like when you're thinking about different qualities of things. So a strong, solid brick house should use a strong, solid line. If you're drawing light flowing grass, then use kind of a light sketchy line as well. So think about matching that line quality to whatever you're drawing, your subject matter. Values are just shades of gray. We use that term a lot. I think I introduced that last class, but just in case. A value are just shades of gray, and that is all that our class will be made up of, our different values. And we'll get into focal point a little bit today. Has anyone ever heard of a focal point for art or drawing or photography? So basically, the focal point is the main subject of whatever image you're creating. It's what you want people to look at first and whatever is most important in that drawing. So we're going to deal with that a lot in this class, and we'll kind of be dealing with that throughout the quarter and kind of as we move on to each project. But you always want to know your focal point, and you want to be able to have someone looking at your work, the viewer, be able to know your focal point as well. So as you're creating a sketch or a finished piece in Illustrator, know your focal point and be able to make it stand out to people looking at your work. So that's kind of why on the drawing challenge, I said, put a really thick dark line around that house, because that will then make the house the focal point and make it stand out. So we'll be going over different ways to make focal points stand out starting today. So next we are going to talk about abstract art versus representational art. And we will also talk about silhouettes as well today. So let's get into that abstract versus representational. All right, so have you guys heard of abstract art? Probably in some other art classes or maybe going to museums or things like that.
Yes.
Yes. So it has its benefits to work abstractly or representationally. Abstract is creating an entire composition. So as we said, a composition is just our frame using just shapes, lines, and then shades of gray, so shades of value. So you can create entire compositions just using those simple things. And then representational is, you know, drawing an actual thing, a person, a tree, a landscape, whatever it may be. So I can just start filling this up with abstract shapes, abstract lines, and now I have a abstract composition. So when you guys think of abstract art, you've probably heard it in like in galleries or thinking of like modern art or things like that. And, you know, for a long time, for like hundreds of years from the Renaissance until like the late 1800s, it was the goal of artists to draw as realistically as possible. But then kind of around the late 1800s with the invention of the camera, there wasn't a need for people to draw as realistically because they could just take a picture. So yes, artists like Picasso, Monet, Matisse, Duchamp, we'll look at some of their art a little later. They started drawing abstractly because they're like, what can art do if I don't need to draw realistically? So a lot of those early artists, early abstract artists started to mess around with abstract art and say, what can I do with this? Can I try drawing something that isn't necessarily representational? And what can that do? And that became kind of the form of modern popular art. But a lot of the early representational artists or early abstract artists, you know, they learned to draw realistically and representationally, and then they went on to try abstract art. So some people will like drawing abstractly, some people will like drawing realistic or representationally. But again, it's good to try both in this class. Sometimes even though all the art I make is representational, doing storyboards and comics and illustrations and things like that, sometimes I like to go back and work on abstract compositions because it allows me to just work on composition without worrying about drawing an actual thing. So kind of each project I would suggest trying both and seeing how you do. But also it's part of your own style. It becomes part of a sliding scale. So we can have like a realistic representational drawing of a face in my quick version here. So we'd say this is a representational drawing. Since it's quick, I'm not taking the time to make it as realistic as possible. I could add shading in here. You know, I could take a lot of time to really make this attempt to be a realistic drawing. But right now you can clearly see it's representation. I'll put a little shading here. We'll put a little shading as well, some hatching for shading. But I can take this and simplify it, and it can become more abstract without becoming completely abstract. So I can just simplify this down. And even though I'm not as realistic, I'm abstracting it a little bit, where this isn't worrying about now being as close to realistic. I gain rid of the shading. I'm using just simple shapes and dots and lines. We can abstract it further. Now it's just kind of a simple head. And what I can do is then abstract this all the way to where it's no longer recognizable as a person and just transform this into circles, shapes, and values. So now we're not even dealing with anything representational. I'm just kind of slowly abstracting that. Okay. So you have to decide kind of what it becomes part of your style with thinking about how much am I going to abstract my style, or do I want to be super realistic? And everyone everyone will have kind of their own style and their own place where they lie along this scale. So that's why it's kind of good to practice both. Practice something really simple, practice something really realistic. and kind of see what you like and see what works for your own style. So that's going to be the biggest thing when you're working with this, is just knowing you can create that entire composition out of just those simple shapes. But lots of times as I'm doing this, I may just working with rectangles here. As I'm working abstractly, it starts to kind of look like a representational image sometimes, which is completely fine. So there's not really just like a hard fine line between these two. Usually you'll have some sort of combination of abstract and representational. I mean, you could have a representational person or face, and then just put abstract shapes behind that person. So there you can combine abstract and representational too. So it's not always one or the other. You can have a combination of both, or it can lie somewhere in the middle between abstract and representational. But we'll talk about both, and you'll have a chance to draw both as you're working in this class. But I encourage you to kind of take some time and do an experiment with both and see how it works out. And especially if you're less experienced and you're having trouble with like, how do I draw a house? How do I draw a person? Then you can go back to the abstract style and work just with those shapes and lines and those different types of value. Okay, any questions about abstract or representational art before we move on? Okay. All right. Now let's talk a little bit about shape. So what is shape? Shape is two-dimensional. So we mentioned last class how all the art we're making in here is applicable for two-dimensional art, so flat artwork. So any artwork that's drawn on a piece of paper, any artwork that is made on a computer screen, all of that is flat two-dimensional art. So shapes are two-dimensional. Okay, so we really need to pay special attention to shape, and shape can do a lot for us in our drawings and our artwork because it's just two-dimensional. Okay, so shapes are two-dimensional, our artwork is two-dimensional. We have to be very careful of how we use shapes, and it can do a lot for us. Form is three-dimensional. So anything that's attempting to look 3D. So have you guys drawn these little cubes like this before? Anyone doodled that cube? Yeah, those things are kind of fun to draw, especially when you're like a kid. And because you realize I'm creating something that looks like a three-dimensional form, but it's just on a flat surface. So sometimes we will want to try and make things look 3D and make it look like a three-dimensional form, but that two-dimensional shape should always take priority over that three-dimensional form. And details are just, usually I like to think of things like texture. So I could have that three-dimensional cube, and depending on what it's made out of, that would be the texture. So I can make this look like a cracked cube of like concrete or stone. So now I've added texture on there. So texture, details are basically just smaller shapes, things like texture on there to get details, but shape should always take priority over those textures and the three-dimensional form. So let's look at another example here. So I really like drawing architecture, buildings, things like that. Whether it's for, just in my sketchbook, going out and drawing some buildings, or spending time, working from photos and drawing buildings. It's a lot of fun. Yeah, you can draw people with shapes, definitely. So when you're drawing things like architecture, there are lots of details. So I'm kind of trying to make this look three-dimensional, like I did with that little cube example. But I also got smaller details in there. I got the little clock here. I got some architectural details, some texture to show that's made of brick. So when you're deciding what to draw, or you're designing something to draw, like you want to come up with a building first scene or a person first scene or whatever it may be, you may have fun and it may be like exciting to draw all those little details, but what should take priority and what you should figure out is this a good shape? So can you black this out and make it into a silhouette and still tell what it is? So shape is basically a silhouette. Just like a shadow of something, or when something's behind a screen and you just see that basic silhouette. So here's our two-dimensional silhouette. And here is the form with details on it. So you can get away a lot of times by just drawing the silhouette of something. You don't always need to draw the details. You don't always need to draw shading to make it look three-dimensional. So prioritize that silhouette and say, can I still tell what this is, even if it's just a silhouette shape? And if you can, then you consider that a good shape, and that shape is working, and I've designed or drawn a good, interesting two-dimensional silhouette there. So some artists really, really rely heavily on two-dimensional shapes and silhouettes. So that is something that can really, it can make your art really interesting. And oftentimes it's cool for the viewer when you eliminate all these details and all these textures and just have a silhouette there. So, you can see the simple, a really simple shape and form. So something like this that we just drew can get turned into a silhouette shape. So you're eliminating the details that make it look three-dimensional, but you still can tell what it is for the most part. So sometimes you'll see a three-dimensional sphere with a bunch of shading on it, highlights, things like that. Other classes you guys may take, or you have taken in the past, where you draw simple shapes for like still lifes, and trying to make something look three-dimensional and make something look realistic. That's not what we're really doing in this class. We're not worried about making something super realistic. We're worried about making really good, clean shapes, and then being able to tell what it is based just on the shape. So yeah, you can do that for people too. Even if I have a person here, I got, details of the face, texture on the skin, some shadows on here. I can still take this and turn this into a silhouette shape, and you should hopefully, if I've done it well, tell what's going on with this and what this is. So you can still tell, hopefully, when this is a silhouette, when I've eliminated all the details, still tell that this is a person in profile. And you can create entire scenes just with those silhouettes as well. So you can get some really cool effects just by designing a scene in silhouette, just using those shapes. I'm just going to draw a little guy kind of walking through the woods here. But I could come in here and add like texture to show that this is rock. Maybe draw like a path with some grass down here, but I want to make this entire composition just using silhouette shapes. It can create a really interesting look. It can create a very kind of a bold, striking look, especially when you use solid black. Solid black is a very powerful value. It gets a lot of attention. Things like that. And try and make this shape a little more interesting. Yeah, Ryan, that's a good question. So I can come in here and add some other, mountains or hills in the background. Let's see if this will work. But not make those solid black. So yeah, I can come in here with a shade of gray, a different value. Fill in this part with that. And still, I'm not going to put any details on that hillside there. I want to keep that just as a simple value. Come in and create some more hills off here in the distance. Get lighter as they go into the distance. Then we can put some real lights. Put the sun up here. Some clouds as well. So there's no details in here. There's no shading to try and make things look three-dimensional. There's just kind of stacks of silhouette shapes here throughout this scene. And again, I think I'll have you guys do something similar to this for the drawing challenge this week, where you need to create an entire scene that just uses silhouette shape. Okay, so no details. I can create details in the shape itself, as I'm doing here, where I'm playing with this silhouette and adding just a little bit more to the shape here to show that what this tree is made of. I can come down here and add some like grass as well, but that's just adding on to that silhouette shape. Any other questions on creating a composition entirely of silhouettes? So this is kind of what I'll have you guys do for the drawing challenge. It'll be the same as kind of last week, where I'll have a photo to use as reference and as inspiration, but to create an entire composition just using silhouette. So depending on what tool you're drawing with, you might have to change it up. If this was pencil, you could do different shades of gray. If this was drawn with pen, you might need to fill in your silhouette shape with maybe like some hatching, or figure out a way to get a different shade of gray to fill up some silhouettes. If some are going to be solid black, some can be different shades of gray. But that will kind of be how you can work it. Oh, and some people also mixed mediums together. So feel free to do that if you want to do like your outline with a you know, a Sharpie, and then fill in some of your shapes with pencil as well. You guys feel free to do that as you're working. All right, so one more thing on shape. Good shape. How do you design a good shape? So we are designers in this class, so we are going to be designing compositions, but what goes in our compositions are shapes. Okay, so a good way to tell if your shape is working well is, can you tell what it is when it's just a silhouette? Okay, so let's look here. I'm going to create a little drawing. Hey, can you guys tell what I'm drawing here? Yeah, very simple house. But what might I say to someone if they turned in a house that looks kind of like this on their on a project? How do we know if this house is designed and if it's a good shape? Well, what we should be able to do is, yeah, silhouette it. So let's fill this in solid black and see if we can tell what the shape is, even if it's a silhouette. So can you guys tell what this shape is, even if there wasn't that house up there? Could you tell that that's for sure a house? Kinda, yeah, it gets iffy, yeah. So that means you haven't designed the best type of shape. So if someone turned that in on assignment, or they were thinking about what to do with that, I would say maybe try and draw that house from a different angle, or design it in a different way where even if it's a silhouette, someone looking at it can clearly tell that it's a house, because it's our job to visually communicate to whoever's looking at a drawing we made or a finished piece of artwork. So how can we redraw this? So I want to really show the angle of that roof there, to show that it's an angled roof. So it's really kind of a triangular shape on top of a rectangular shape. Okay. And then things like this chimney, I want this chimney to come up and break the silhouette there, so it creates a more interesting shape. So here I'll go and I'll even try and create an interesting shape for that chimney. So hopefully now this is going to read better as a silhouette. I could even add like a little bush here on the side that can add to that silhouette. So let's silhouette this one and see how it looks. So there's never like one right way or wrong way to create a good silhouette shape. It's kind of just experimenting, trial and error, working on your sketches and kind of trying a few different shapes for whatever you're trying to draw. But hopefully now this one here on the left can be more easily recognizable than the one on the right as a house. Okay. And so even though this one has like the texture on the roof, some details of windows and things like that, you want to kind of switch your brain to really start and see silhouette shapes. So that should take priority when you're designing. And I usually kind of like to develop this silhouette shape first, because you can always go back later and add in more details, okay? So I can always come in here and add details, add windows and doors and textures. But once I have this, it's hard to go back and change the shape. So it's easier to go in and add more details. And lots of times people will think, oh, if I just keep adding details on here, that will make it more recognizable. Well, the details aren't really what someone who looks at your drawing is going to see. What they see first is an overall shape and an overall impression of that art that you're making. And then the more you go on, you don't even need to add as many details here. So I can be limited with the details I add. Lots of times details kind of get in the way of your silhouette. Lots of times details can make a drawing like too busy or too chaotic. But I can, come in here and just add little subtle things to this silhouette shape to make it more interesting. Add a little bird up here. Add another bush. Can add like a clothesline coming out here. But no amount of details that you're doing can save your silhouette. Okay, so prioritize, get that good silhouette first, and then maybe you decide I don't want any details in that silhouette shape. Maybe just the silhouette is enough. Maybe the silhouette can be really bold and really interesting. So that can be a good way for you guys to try and think about your art and kind of try to just switch the way you think about when you're making a drawing to prioritize first making really good shapes and then add details where you want to. You don't need to add details everywhere. We're going to get into talking about that later in the quarter, about where to add details, when to add details, but you definitely don't want like details all over your entire drawing. Okay. And just a quick note on focal point. I just want to start us talking about focal point. Before we get too much further into class, because that's going to be something that we're dealing with for the whole rest of the quarter. So let's just make an abstract composition. Just going to create some simple shapes here, some lines. All right. So again, that focal point is what you want someone to look at in your drawing, how you want to draw the viewer's eye to something specific. So even if you're working abstractly, let's say we want this shape, number 1 here, to be the focal point shape. We want people to look at that shape first. We want it to stand out to the viewer. Can you guys think of anything that I could do to that shape to make it bold and make it stand out? Yes, thicker line. So going back to that line work. So just by making this a thick line, and if all the other lines stay thin, that's going to make it really bold and really stand out. Okay, so just like you guys did on the house for the drawing challenge, just putting that thicker line around it really makes it stand out, especially if you surround it with a bunch of thin lines. And yes, fill it in. That is another really good one. Fill it in with a dark value. So I'm not going to go completely solid black so we can still see that outline. We'll go just into a dark gray here. So the dark value combined with the thick dark line really makes that stand out now. And I can fill in these shapes with lighter values. As long as it's not as dark as that focal point shape, they will all be less important. So I can get some of these shapes darker. They don't all have to be, or none of them should be as dark as that one focal point shape. That one got a little too dark. That's kind of competing there. There we go, that's better. And we'll get into later in the quarter, you will have, sometimes you'll have more than one focal point. Sometimes you'll have 2 or 3 focal points. But kind of we'll start out by just having that one focal point stand out. So you can use a really good silhouette shape to make that focal point stand out. And you can also use a dark shape and also use that thick line work. So we're going to come back to focal points a lot in this quarter. I just kind of wanted to introduce this idea here. So then when you guys are working on the drawing challenge, I'll try and have you create a focal point in that drawing challenge as well as you're working. All right, any questions on silhouette shapes or focal points or abstract art versus representational art? All right, so let's just look at a few artists really quick. Okay. So yeah, I want you guys to look at art every time we're in class, because looking at good art makes you better artists. So this is just to talk about abstract art versus representational art. So this is the artist Michelangelo. So as I said, for like hundreds of years, the goal of Western artists was to draw like really realistically. So artists like Michelangelo through the Renaissance, basically until the late 1800s, they were trying to draw as realistically as possible. So realistic lighting, realistic shadows, realistic anatomy, things like that. And that was all for a purpose, because art at that time was used for recording and used for like telling stories a lot of times. So people would hire portrait artists to paint them. So obviously you wanted to look a lot like you. But then with that camera came along, people were kind of freed and able to abstract. So this is Picasso, as you guys can see someone mentioned in the chat earlier. So he learned to draw realistically. So this was him at 15 years old. He could draw and paint amazingly well. He was an amazing realistic artist, but we don't really hear about or see his realistic art that well. So he got trained to be really good. He's like, well, I'm really good at this. What else can I do with my art? So he started to abstract his art. So here is kind of a scale of abstraction where he's abstracting the more and more he goes through with his own style and as he ages. So this is at 25 years old, and then that's at 89 years old. I'm not sure these ages are completely accurate, but you get the idea that his style evolved and he introduced abstraction into his own style. And then a lot of artists went fully abstract. This is Marcel Duchamp. This one is called Nude Descending a Staircase. Does this look like a person going down a staircase? I suppose maybe slightly, but really it's kind of the only the title is helping it hold on to any sort of representational art. So it's called Nude Descending a Staircase. You kind of get some nice diagonal movement here, so you could argue that it looks like a person walking downstairs, but this one is much more about falling down the stairs, with some movement in there. But this one's more about just playing around with shapes, playing around with values, repeating shapes over and over to kind of create a rhythm and create some diagonal movement in there. And then they went completely away from anything representational. This is Kandinsky. And this one's just called composition number 8. So as you can see, he's playing with shapes, lines, and in this case, color as well as value. So we're all the same except no color. So you're seeing some representational imagery even in an abstract composition, which is going to inevitably happen as you draw abstract stuff. As you look at abstract stuff, you'll see representational imagery in your own art And that's just kind of a natural way that our brains work. But abstracting was taken for, it can be a very powerful tool. This is another one by Picasso. This is called Guernica. I believe this is kind of an illustration. This one is a mural of the Spanish Civil War. So here the abstraction allows him to show kind of the pain and torment on these people's faces and kind of the horrors of what's going on. So abstraction can really help you get a sense of emotion, a sense of movement in your drawings without drawing everything really realistically. And it was also widely used in things like animation. So here is Mary Blair. So she did a lot of the concept art for Peter Pan and other Disney films of that time, but simplifying the art and making it flatter and more simplified worked really well for animation. So talking about shape now. So using just silhouettes to create art. Has anyone seen the show Batman the Animated Series? Anyone seen that show from the 90s? Nice, a few of you guys have. Yeah, it came out in the early 90s, and the style that it developed really kind of influenced a lot of cartoons all the way till now that are still coming out. But what the artist Bruce Timm did was really simplify the animation style. So he's really just focusing on creating interesting silhouette shapes. So this was kind of the logo and title card for the show. But it's really bold and really powerful and really simple as well. So you can count the amount of shapes here. There's probably, 5 to 10 different shapes used in this, but it creates a very bold, very striking image. And it's so bold and striking because it's very simple. It doesn't get bogged down with drawing details. You have a few little lines here for folds in the cape and a couple eyes, but that's about it for details. So oftentimes eliminating details shows a more unique way to portray imagery and can kind of show your mastery of two-dimensional mediums by just showing really good shape design. Here's another still from the intro of that show. So no details in this silhouette. Look at this really, really strong, nicely designed silhouette. You know who the character is, you know what the character's doing. You have a sense of movement from that cape blowing in the wind, but it's really easy to read. You can look at this for a split second and know exactly who that character is. And even the buildings are done with really simple silhouettes as well. So yeah, the drawing challenge this week will deal with silhouettes, but I really want you guys to focus on those silhouette shapes when you're coming up with your ideas for future projects. All right, just a couple other things. This is the artist Eyvind Earle. Has anyone seen Sleeping Beauty, the classic Disney movie? It's a very, very beautifully done Disney movie. So it's super highly detailed and very stylized as well. So if you have a chance to go watch Sleeping Beauty, you can see this is the artist Eyvind Earle. He created the overall look for this film. So they hire concept artists to kind of draw characters and backgrounds and things like that to figure out what is this movie going to look like and feel like visually. And the whole part of his style that worked really well was using really flat, really good silhouettes. So especially look at these characters here. Each character is made up of, 4 or 5 shapes. So we have one shape for the hair, a shape for the skin of the face, a shape for the arms, a shape for the torso, a shape for the dress, and 2 shapes for the feet. And lots of times, you don't have to get bogged down with drawing fingers and facial features and texture in the hair and things like that. Just having these simple silhouettes it's almost harder to design and create art this simply and have it still read well. So this is a really masterful use of silhouette shapes. And what you can see what he's then doing here in the trees is creating simple rectangular shapes for the trees, but then putting texture on that. So he first created the silhouette and is then adding details, which is kind of the order you guys should go first. So first design a good silhouette shape, an interesting silhouette, one that reads well, and then you can add details on it. And even just look at how he designed the plants in the foreground. Basically created a stamp shape and just repeated it. This is the same silhouette shape repeated over and over for these grass and leaf textures. But it works really well. It's really simple and creates a really unique look for the film and for this concept art. All right. Oh, a good way to think about it when you're designing shapes and working in Adobe Illustrator especially is think about like you're cutting out pieces of paper. So this is an artist who works with literally cutting out paper. So you can think about as you, especially once you get into working in Illustrator, think about the shapes you're making in Illustrator is like cutting out little pieces of paper to create artwork. Okay, so yeah, this is Cindy Kernawan. So she's on Instagram. I think that's where I got this image from. So yeah, really cool style, simplified. So she's creating the texture out of painted pieces of paper. So she like painted this paper green and then cuts it out for the grass. But that is a good way to think about your art as you're working. Think about it just like cutting out pieces of paper. All right, so that will be it for today. Any questions before you guys head out, just let me know. But other than that, I will be in lab hours later today and tomorrow. Projects are due next week, but email me or come to lab hours if you guys need help or have any questions. Other than that, I will see you guys in a week for our next lecture.